Introduction to Retera Model Studio. The first thing you need to do to obtain Retera Model Studio is to simply download it. You can get it at the Hive Workshop if you click on Tools, and you'll see a list of Hive Workshop tools, and on that list, if you just scroll down just a little bit, is Retera Model Studio. It's a convenient program, and as soon as you click on Download, it will give you a zip. In my case, suppose I had a folder called Applications where I wanted to save the zip. I could save the zip into there, go ahead and show in folder on that, so you navigate to wherever the zip downloaded on your computer. On a default setup of your computer, that might be the Downloads folder, but for me, I chose to put it in a custom location. From there, I use 7-zip, but you can use any zip utility you'd like to simply unzip Retera Model Studio. From there, you should see an exe and a Java jar. Retera Model Studio is a Java program created for editing Warcraft 3 models. Because of that, it needs to run a Java environment in order to execute, but for a lot of the users who don't enjoy downloading Java, that can be fairly annoying. So to simplify that process, I have an exe that when we run it, simply runs a version of Java that's included with this program. Once you double-click the exe, you'll be presented with this menu. Now this menu might default to try to pick what it can find, but it gives us the option of setting up the program, in particular the source of Warcraft 3 art assets. As you may know, Retera Model Studio is a model editor for editing Warcraft 3 models, and in order to make that more convenient, it's important for you to tell me, as the program author, and as tell the program, where the models on your computer are stored. So by default, it turns out that my particular configuration here is finding that my registry key was set to an older version of Warcraft 3, one of those old patch 126 backups from when I used to have the CDs lying around and I kept a copy. But if you don't want that and you actually want to use Reforged, the same Retera Model Studio program is compatible with those old versions and with Warcraft 3 Reforged. Generally, I tell people that it only supports Warcraft 3 Reforged because supporting the older stuff can be time-consuming in some cases, but realistically, in most cases, if you feed my program art assets from an older version of the game, it'll be able to find them. It has software inside of the Retera Model Studio that sort of grew up with Reforged as the Reforged patches were coming out and the pre-patches, and during those times I was creating versions of my code to support as much as possible different versions of Warcraft 3. So in my case, I have Reforged installed in the default location, C:\program files Warcraft 3. If I go to that location and push open, what I'll see now is a new pop-up that sees the Reforged installation and realizes that that needs to have an associated language with it in order to load. You'll see in a moment why this is important. In my case, I'm going to go ahead and choose English, but you can see that I've also used Spanish Reforged on my computer in the past, so they're both highlighted in a black coloration to say that they're already located locally on my computer. These other languages are languages that Reforged might support, but in the case of the Retera Model Studio, it doesn't see those as having already been downloaded to the computer to use. So I'm going to go ahead and use the English here and push OK on that. And you can see that by default, it loads in the mod files for Warcraft 3, as well as the HD mod files. If you're a user who's going to want to edit models in the older classic graphics of Warcraft 3, there's an option right here for classic graphics mode that'll toggle those settings. Meanwhile, if you're a user that wants to use those Reforged HD newer assets, you can click the Reforged graphics mode right here. You can see if I click it multiple times, it'll complain that it says, well, it's already in the HD mode. And you can tell the difference simply by whether those HD mods have been loaded. So if I go ahead and press OK on that, right now we're in the HD mode, you'll see once that's happened, it'll take a moment. The software is going to read through some of that data that's stored there, and you'll start to see the program. Now I just double clicked the top of the program here because I like to do full screen, but that's up to you as a user, whether you like to have a full screen program or not. You'll notice there's an ad that I've put in the front page here trying to convince users to go and use the newer version made by other people. This happened because Retera Model Studio is open source, And although the version that I maintain has fallen a little bit behind what those other people are doing, because I've been working on some other fun projects with my time, basically I was trying to encourage this idea that we want to have a world where we have multiple contributors and versions of the software built by other people. So the fact that they have a version that's become so different from mine is something I'd like to support. I think that that can be good in general for the health of software to have modding of my own modding software. Regardless, let's take a moment and talk about some of the basic features of the program. There's 3 tabs up here at the top: View, Edit, and Model. And we can talk a little bit more about what those are once we choose some kind of 3D asset to actually modify. In our case, since it has human open by default, let's go ahead and double click the human peasant right here. After I double click that, it takes a moment and you can see it loads in the human peasant character model. And we can preview his various different animations and kind of get a look and a feel for how this character looks. You may notice that the shader code that I'm using in my version is fairly simple. Essentially, I took the shader logic that was getting used in the older classic graphics of Warcraft 3, and I retrofit it with this program so that it would support the Reforged assets. So because of that, there is not yet a version that previews the Reforged assets in their sort of shiny, fancy graphics like you would see in-game. But even without that, there are some other tools that exist in the world that can try to preview that, and you always have the option of previewing your character asset inside of Warcraft 3 World Editor. So as far as the features, once you have a model open like this, you can click on the Edit tab, and you can see the basics of the Edit tab are fairly similar to most 3D modeling kind of software you might be used to. We basically have a simple set of views that you can use to modify. So I could, for example, select part of this this axe here, and you just drag a box to select, and you can hold Shift to select more. Along with that, if you find that selecting things is taking you too long, or it's a little bit difficult to be precise, you can use some other selection modes. For example, selecting faces, or selecting by a cluster, which tries to find things that are physically connected, or selecting by groups, which generally tries to use groups that are sort of built into the particular model file in the model's data. There's also an option to select nodes and animate that brings in a sort of drop-in footer element here where you can see the actual animation of the character, and this allows you then to choose a particular frame if you want to tweak the way that the character, maybe during like the attack animation. So here I've clicked this button in the lower right hand corner here, choose time bounds. If you click that and say, maybe I want to use the attack animation, you could say, well, right as he's swinging his axe right here, I would really like to change the way that his axe is oriented. And you might notice at first you don't see any nodes here. You can't select any vertices, but that's simply because of this nodes tab hasn't been expanded. So if I click that, for example, and highlight everything in the tree beneath it, you'll see a huge number of different nodes highlight and some of their metadata. But basically, if we just go to weapon, you can see, here's the weapon, and I can say, okay, in this particular frame, I'd like to go, we have select and move, select and rotate, and select and scale. And I can say, all right, in this frame, I want his weapon to be rotated a different way. And as you use these, you can click on, like a left click on the actual widget right here to modify, but you can also right click out in space, which is something I tend to do that I find convenient. And you can change maybe the orientation of his axe in that particular frame. And you'll notice in the frames around that, the axe goes back to where it was. So we've just edited this one particular frame, and you can actually use the left and right arrow to jump to the keyframes down here highlighted in green. Somebody was once asking me earlier, what does it mean if one of these frames down here is orange? If you look in the lower right hand corner, you'll notice there's an orange rectangle versus a green one. The difference there is simply that the orange one has scaling and translation as well as the rotation. So in general, rotation is green, scaling is sort of orange-red, and translation is blue in my software. So along with that, that's kind of how you would tweak a particular animation frame, but you might notice we have this view of all these different nodes here, and sometimes people would say, well, how do I look into some of that? So one of the things that I had iterated on a little bit here in the design is this model tab where you can see some comments in the file, header information, metadata about the animations, and get a little bit more of a tabular view, such as the textures that are used, some of the material information to go along with those textures, and some of these kinds of things. One of the issues that we ran into with some of that is that while I was developing the features in this model tab to really just kind of get a robust feature set as far as the extra things that it can do, I ended up going and spending some time on a little bit different project. And so while I was doing that, some of the community of people who have been using this software actually were contributing to it. And so there's a fan-made version where this model tab is a little bit more feature complete. It's got a little bit more that it can do. But in my version that I had worked on prior to that, it's still here. You can see a lot of these things. You can view textures. You could change a texture path or some of these other things. But just if you want that feature completeness, I think a lot of people go and they use the fork of my software you can find on GitHub, created by the user Twi'lek, that has some advanced, more robust features in that model tab. Other features that we have, sort of a second older system that's kind of a little bit of duplicate functionality with some of the texture browsing here, is the Tools Edit Textures window. If you go in that, you can see, again, a list of all the different textures. This one, in some cases, tries to simplify a little bit, although for the most part, they're very similar between them. So this one lets you export some of the textures as well as changing a texture path. Maybe I would look at this peasant's hammer and say, well, hey, why don't we take the texture of his axe and put that on his hammer and push enter down here. And it's very much the same. If I was just in this model tab and I was down here and looked and said, oh, hey, look, here his this now says axe, but it has axe twice. You'll notice after I changed the texture of his hammer, you can see there that the hammer looking a little bit different. That one's a little bit hard to see, so we could change another one. We could say maybe this time we'll change it with the model tab. For example, if we go to this gold bag, and let's say we're going to give the gold bag the texture of his hair instead, now it's almost going to look like a bag of silver. It's going to be super gray. You can see that here. Once you change the texture, it just updates. You can start viewing that in the model. And as soon as you go to something like stand gold animation, you'll see the totally different texture on that particular part of the model there. So that lets you customize that, which can be convenient for changing textures and some of these things. Another thing that I sometimes like to do if I'm spending time on these sort of tabular model details like you would have in the model tab is that I actually just go and save the model as an MDL text file. If you do that, and let's say I just create peasant example.mdl here in my documents folder, we'll notice that once you do that, it becomes a convenient MDL file that's very nice for tabular editing. If I go ahead and edit with Notepad++ here, you'll see it'll pull up the peasant. Here you go, I have a model peasant. Editing the model in MDL gives you access to a number of convenient parameters and settings that you might see previewed in the software, but sometimes it's more convenient to actually just save as MDL and go in there and modify them. One of the other features that I really enjoy with my software is the ability to actually combine models. So with that, what generally we can do is to do an import, and I can say, all right, why don't I import from the footman into the peasant? And if you go ahead and do that, what that'll give you is a menu that it takes a little while to load. It's a little bit complex, but essentially we try to take all the data that's in one model and put it in another model. This could be useful for mounting a footman on a horse, or it could be useful for taking all of the footman's animation data and applying it to the peasant. So here I have this import menu as an example. So if I just push finish by default, it'll drop the two models into the same file. But actually, if I click all invisible and exotic animations, it'll make it a little bit clearer what that's going to do. So if I go ahead and click finish now, you can see I still have our peasant that we were playing around with, who has his bag of silver going on. But at the same time, after we go past all the peasant's animations out past the end, we now will find that we have also the footman's animations. And so suddenly we have the footman model and the peasant model together in the same file. If we go to the unanimated view, you'll notice they're both present. That what I've done is essentially pulled in the other model and transposed all of its animations to different points in the timeline to then be after the peasant. So you can mix and match features in this import menu so that you could have a peasant with the sword of a footman, or a peasant with the motion data of a footman, or a lot of other convenient utilities for reusing models, which is generally how that import can be very useful. But for some people for whom that's too time consuming, I have an add menu with some other simple features where you could say, maybe I just want to add a single animation from another unit, and just say, why don't we just add for example, the footman's attack onto a peasant. I say it, footman attack 1, we'll use the peasant attack 1. You'll notice what that'll do down at the bottom here is create a new animation where it tries to import that in. We're still in a model that has the footman, but as you can see here, now we have attack 1 in this file that also has attack 1 of the footman, but we've imported in the footman as well as using this add menu to put the footman's animation on the peasant. So there's a lot of different utilities you can use for these kind of combinations to create interesting and fun characters, as well as you can also combine 3D shapes directly. Another feature that the users tend to enjoy is the ability to try to have one character with the animations or motion of another. As an example, let's say that I wanted to have the human sorceress, and maybe we were looking at this model and said, it would be really interesting if we could put a bow in her hand and try to make her act like a night elf archer. In general, that's kind of a somewhat complex task as far as character geometry and art, but if we go ahead and look at the night elf archer and say maybe we could just do that, where we just sort of delete the main physical body of this character and then import in the physical body off the other character, you just sort of ask yourself, well, how would you do that? Generally, it should be pretty straightforward to do. In this case, if I just select everything and delete it, except like the quiver and the bow, you can just go to Script Skin Splice and say, we're going to splice in, how about the sorceress right there? And I'll push OK on that, and it'll drop in the sorceress, and you'll see now I have the sorceress trying to act like a night elf archer. And sometimes some portions of the model might not import exactly correctly. You can see there are some elements of what's going on here that look like I should probably tweak it, and some things don't always work exactly right at the same time. The reason that it translates over is that it uses the name of the character components. So it'll work as long as the name of some of these components match, but if they ever don't, you could run into trouble. Another case that's important to keep in mind is that sometimes the character rigs are just a slightly different size, and so sometimes it can actually be really quick to try to fix that. For example, if we go to the sorceress and toggle that all on and select it, and say maybe we're just going to try to make it larger and fit to the night elf. We can go ahead and click on this scale tool here, select and scale, and then toggle the nodes to be visible, and you can see the night elf nodes are actually larger, they're taller. And so we can go ahead and scale and then do a little bit of a drag and try to get to where our character matches the nodes that we were copying into. And the closer you get to that, the better this character is going to look. The more they'll start to look like something sane and reasonable. And you'll have a character, you can see there's something still messed up with this hair, but for the most part, we've created what looks like a sorceress with a bow, and it's a generally straightforward concept. You just kind of were saying, take this one character and put the model skinning on of the other character applied to that. In this tool, once you've created a character, once you've done some combinations and some edits and made something you think is kind of fun, the other thing that's very convenient is you can do a straightforward save as to a Warcraft MDX. So let's say that I was going to call this Sorceress Archer and .mdx and just save that as a Warcraft binary model file to my documents. As soon as I do that, you can fire up your Reforged world editor for Warcraft. The file should just import right directly in. Once my Reforged world editor loads up, just as an example here, you can go ahead and go to My Documents and try to import a file like that. For example, this Sorceress Archer. And then I could go in here to the unit editor, go to where we have Sorceress, and change that model file to be my custom Sorceress Archer, and click OK. Once you do that, if you go to the unit palette over here and drop in your Sorceress, you'll see that there it is, the same exact art asset that we just created in this Retera Model Studio, and now it's right there inside of Warcraft 3 for our custom map. So that is another convenience to this tool, that we save directly to Warcraft 3 model format, so we can import that straight into Warcraft 3. As another note, if you go to the Edit Preferences window, there's several different settings that you can access, but in the Warcraft Data tab, if you click back on Classic Graphics, for the users that enjoy the classic graphics, you can just go ahead and open up the old classic characters for Warcraft 3. In general, I try to support the same or similar feature set so that you could certainly do the same thing with the Warcraft 3 Classic style models as well. Although some of the systems and buttons that you would use are in some cases slightly different, the end result is typically the same. And it's certainly possible to do using some of the more advanced import tools and other things. That has been my introduction to Retera Model Studio. Thank you for watching.